But I'd like to share with you today some experiences of mine. I'm the president of the British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club, which encompasses all the various cryptids around the world from a scientific perspective. Our board of directors is composed largely of scientists and several laymen like myself who are interested in the subject. And we've taken our investigations the length and breadth of the world. We've conducted extensive Sasquatch expeditions all over North America. We've also done extensive searching for unknown lake cryptids in freshwater venues across the world, from the UK to Canada, United States, and various other regions. We've also explored the seas around British Columbia, California, Oregon, and Washington in search for an aquatic anomaly called Cadborosaurus. But perhaps closest to my heart, because of the physical enjoyment of being in British Columbia and Pacific Northwest countryside, is Sasquatch. And one of the reasons I'm interested in the Sasquatch phenomenon is from an investigative viewpoint. I have been working for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for a number of years as a civilian in support services, involved in many facets of criminal investigation. These involve everything from forensics on a smaller scale, all the way through to investigation techniques, methodologies, and otherwise. And one of the things I found absolutely phenomenal about the police force that I personally belong to is that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has investigated more Sasquatch reports than any other police force in North America, bar none. And what is also amazing is the number of peace officers who are involved in the discovery of Sasquatch phenomena. We have Dennis Hereford, who comes from Washington State, Vern Harrington, who is from Capalis. These are gentlemen who actually found Sasquatch tracks. We have Sheriff Cooper from the Lummi Indian Reserve, who was also involved in Sasquatch activity back in the 1970s, and many RCMP detachments right across Canada. A lot of people have been focusing in on the Manitoba footage recently. That footage was actually reported to the RCMP, and the RCMP did a due diligence on it, but really couldn't go very far because the Sasquatch hadn't committed a crime. In fact, when the original sighting had taken place in the vicinity back in the 1970s, the fellows from the Poplar Point Reserve, which is not too far from the Norway House Reserve, actually had to send information to the British Columbia headquarters because our particular division, which is known as E Division, has slightly more experience in dealing with Sasquatches. Sometimes the RCMP has had to deal with issues that are quite perplexing. In 1977, I mentioned this a couple of days ago, a bus full of passengers on a Greyhound bus encountered what appeared to be a Sasquatch crossing the road in Chilliwack, British Columbia. A full report was made to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and our members came out and investigated the whole thing. But before this escalated into something very serious and potentially dangerous, the perpetrators of a hoax came forward and showed the RCMP how this particular thing was done. They were let off with a very serious warning. But in my years of working with the RCMP, I have found a huge interest in the force in the subject of Sasquatch. Many members will talk to me about my strange hobby and what have you, and then they'll come out and tell me about a closet encounter that they had with a Sasquatch of their own. For fear of ridicule, police officers, like anybody else, are very reluctant indeed to share that information with anybody else. I have investigated Sasquatch sightings from a scientific perspective for a number of years, but since I got into policing about 4 years ago, my thrust has changed. Of course, scientific methodologies are employed. I'm sure that the most popular program in North America right now is CSI, the Crime Scene Investigation people. I've watched that program on one occasion and I died laughing because the technology that they have in those particular programs is stuff that we would dream of having. It's wonderful. One day in the future, perhaps they'll take ideas from TV programs and implement them in true policing. But I've discovered that in dealing with the Sasquatch phenomenon, law enforcement investigation techniques are indeed extremely useful. And in fact, I've seen a number of Sasquatch investigators out there, whether they're doing this consciously or unconsciously, use policing techniques. René de Hinden was the master of this. He conducted every single investigation he ever did just as a police officer would, not as a scientist, but as a police officer would. I would include John Green as well. Whether he's conscious of the way he did things, he certainly was. Tom Steenberg is another gentleman that has used those methods and technologies very, very well. Daniel Perez also. I see Daniel with a pad in his hand. He's like one of those old beat cops with the rumpled suit and the hat. and Dan will be out there taking notes on every single thing. That sort of methodology is extremely critical in the Sasquatch world. Recording every fundamental detail so that you can go over it afterwards to eliminate the hoaxers from those who have genuine experiences. In distilling this down to a shorter period of time because of time constraints, I want to focus on something that is really urgent here in the world of Sasquatch, and where law enforcement also holds a parallel course. And this is the subject of DNA evidence. Short of bringing in an actual carcass of a Sasquatch, we need to bring in something that is substantive. And from a law enforcement point of view and from a legal point of view, we need to have Sasquatch DNA. And that can come in a variety of sources, from hair follicles, from tissue, from bone, from marrow, from a variety of sources. The difficulty in obtaining that is A, finding a Sasquatch, and B, the dilemma of to kill or not to kill. I'm on the non-kill side, purely because I really do not feel that science has paid enough attention to this particular topic that we would have to kill one to appease and assuage the doubters out there. I think it's an unfair sacrifice. That being said, if the carcass of a Sasquatch was found, it was already dead, I wouldn't have any qualms about it being dissected for scientific purposes. But as far as the kill and no-kill issue is concerned, I've had a look at this with members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and with the Crown, as we call the prosecution up there in Canada. And the feeling is pretty much the same down here in the United States. If a Sasquatch is killed, there are massive legal implications that take place. Let's start with the, let's say that Sasquatch is not from the Homo family. Let's say that it's a North American elementary primate, an ape of some sort. There are issues here from the point of view of wildlife legislation, particularly in Canada, that would cause massive problems for anybody who was consciously searching one of these animals. De facto, any animal that hasn't been discovered by science in Canada is protected by it under the Wildlife Act, provincially and also federally. There are massive implications for somebody who consciously goes out and slays one of these animals. There are repercussions that would be massive. One thing that I know about prosecuting district attorneys here in the United States and Crown prosecutors in Canada is they thoroughly enjoy the concept of setting a precedent. You earn your spurs, as it were, in the legal realm here by who you prosecute, how you prosecute them, and what sort of precedent you set for the law books. I know really well from Canada that if you were to shoot a Sasquatch and it was a primate, you would definitely be prosecuted under that. The RCMP itself, because we're the national police force, would lay the charges against you and the Crown would prosecute you. It would be done on a provincial basis and it would be done on a federal basis. Now, if, for instance, a Sasquatch was killed consciously by someone and it turned out to be of the genus Homo, there are massive complications here because that, technically speaking, is homicide in Canada. I can't speak for American jurisdictions, but I can certainly speak for them in Canada. And what would happen is there would certainly be a trial. There would be a test case here to evaluate that. It's a very dangerous thing. In discussing it with American police officers and what have you, their experience would be, from what they know of prosecutors down here in this country, there'd be some hotshot honcho in whatever jurisdiction you are who would take this prosecution on with massive relish. So my warning to anybody who's thinking about going out there and bagging a Sasquatch, think very carefully about the legal implications of your act and your deed, from a moral standpoint and also that from a legal standpoint. I'll leave that topic alone because it's highly controversial. I leave it to your conscience. The RCMP, as a police force, has been involved in an investigation in Canada called the Missing Women's Task Force. Approximately 68 women disappeared over a 15-year period. And when this took place, the Vancouver Police Department, in which the jurisdiction was, where they all disappeared, had massive problems in dealing with this. When the RCMP were brought on board, we added our support services and our investigative services to this particular case. And from what I gather in talking to the investigators, this was an incredible endeavor, because what they did is they were able to discover the remains and DNA, microcosmical amounts of DNA, on a farm in a small town in the suburb of Vancouver, where the remains of at least 27 of these women have now been found. Now, this exercise was one of forensic brilliance, because a lot of these women had been, it seems, dissected, chopped up, turned into small fragments. But using a team of forensic archaeologists, they sifted through massive quantities of soil. We're talking about 100,000 cubic meters of soil. This is public knowledge. I'm not sharing anything that isn't in the newspapers with you in this regard. They went through huge amounts of soil, and you would have thought you wouldn't have found any DNA in there. There would have been decomposition. There would have been loss in a variety of ways. It could have been washed into the watershed and what have you. But they were able to find and ID the remains of 27 women in that circumstance, which makes me think we have Sasquatch evidence all over the place. They have to be walking on soil. When they are walking on soil, there is a distinct possibility that they are leaving deposits of skin, much as we do when we leave dry skin marks all over the place. The air is permeated with human skin fragments all over the place. We haven't begun to look in the various areas that we could look into. Soil, for one. We also need to be looking on trees for DNA evidence. Sasquatches are known to scratch trees, pull branches, what have you, and we should be looking for these things. Just yesterday, John Andrews was talking about the sign that he found, the roadway sign, that had a form of fingerprint on it. Nowadays, with the technology that police forces have, I really wish that had been preserved. It would have been absolutely fantastic to have that analyzed. But you still have the sign, but do you have the fingerprints on it, or has it been handled out of all proportion?
I think we got to take a closer look sometime and see what's left on that.
Yeah, I would love to do that, and if you'd like to lend it to the RCMP, I could have our fingerprint people look at that. These areas where latent fingerprints occur are just phenomenal. As Jimmy Chilcutt will tell you, you don't see this because you don't have the trained eye, but people like him who are latent fingerprint experts, who are used by organizations like the DEA, FBI in the United States, and Interpol internationally, have the trained eye to be able to see this sort of stuff, not only on dermal ridges and what have you, but on other extraneous material where these creatures could have been. If they're leaving dermal ridges in their footprints, they're also leaving dermal ridges in their fingerprints. Quite often people will go to a site and say, well, I saw a Sasquatch walk over a fence. Okay, what did it do? It put its hand on the fence. Where it put its hand on the fence, it had to leave some sort of residual remnant, i.e. a fingerprint or even bodily secretions of some sort. You'll leave sweat, you'll leave body oils and what have you. These are areas that have not been looked at previously. In talking to law enforcement officers, they said, you guys haven't even scratched the surface in regard to what you could be doing out there to make your case more credible. Because not only are we having to satisfy the scientific requirements of Sasquatchology, we're also having to satisfy the legal aspects of it as well. The British Columbia Scientific Cryptozoology Club, of which I'm president and on the board of directors, has a preservation and conservation mandate. We've been in discussions with groups like the Land Conservancy in British Columbia who have the same kind of viewpoint. This is remarkable. They are a habitat preservation organization who, through the stories of the Aboriginal First Nations people there, eyewitnesses, and anecdotal evidence galore in certain regions of BC, they have actually asked for funds to set aside these lands as protected Sasquatch habitat. This is an amazing thing. If we are to take this any further, take this animal preservation as far as Sasquatch is concerned to the next level, which is maybe municipal or district government, then we have provincial or state governments, and then we have the federal governments, we need to satisfy a huge amount of legal requirements before we can do so. Sometimes I'll point to the federal government, particularly down here in the United States, and I say, well, you already recognize Sasquatch. And they'll say, since when? I said, well, if you take a look at the training manual that's given to members of the United States Army Corps of Engineers in the past, you will see a reference in there to the flora and fauna of the Pacific Northwest. Whether this is a tongue-in-cheek thing that somebody planted in there, or it was some sort of hidden agenda thing, I don't like to speculate or get into conspiracies, but that's a theory. Why is it in that book, plain and simple, of the various flora and fauna of the Pacific Northwest? Why have you got it in a United States government federal publication if you don't recognize the animal? We need to be able to have something that justifies the inclusion of Sasquatch in military manuals and in the manuals of various state bodies, preservation groups, wildlife services in states, provinces, other jurisdictions, whatever. And we need to do this by being methodological. We need to be organized. We cannot afford to be Jeb and Zeke going out there and hunting the beast anymore. It doesn't work, plain and simple. Organization and method is critical. Credibility is critical. I see that most people in my conversations with many of you here are sane, rational people who are looking for the object of our desire, which is the Sasquatch. There are dozens and dozens of methodologies employed in looking at this. And, I've talked to many police officers about some of the methodologies that people are employing. Not one of them has ever been laughed at other than the utterly radical and utterly stupid. Sasquatch researchers who are employing motion sensor cameras, who are using bait traps, who are using mud traps, every single one of these has been looked upon in my discussions with police officers as being very rational, very sensible. There's no such thing as a real method and a non-real method. Whatever works, plain and simple. Police forces have shown massive innovation by going away from tried, true, tested methodologies and experimenting in new areas to try and get the evidence or try and get a confession or a testimony in ways that you've never done before. The wonderful thing about the Sasquatch world is because we don't have any rules, regulations, governing bodies, although some people like to be governing bodies, but not all of us, we have the freedom and free rein to do anything that we please out there. And if it works, bring it back and share it with the rest of us. Because the sharing of information is critical here, plainly and simply. We're very blessed indeed over the years to have eminently qualified scientists, Dr. Krantz, Professor Meldrum, Vladimir Markotic, Leroy Fisher, amongst others, other gentlemen like Darius Swindler, Roderick Sprague, and what have you from the scientific community. I'm now trying to organize within all the various Sasquatch groups that I know of, I'm trying to organize all the people who are in law enforcement to work in a coordinated manner so that we can use the technologies, that we can use the methodologies that we have to try and find and locate specific evidence for this animal, and that's got to be DNA. To satisfy the requirements, we have to look for DNA, plain and simple as that. It's a massive task that's going to require a huge amount of organization. And we're not going to leave the layman out of this. Anybody is welcome to join, but we're trying to do this from a law enforcement perspective because a lot of our guys have the access to the kinds of equipment that are required for this kind of endeavor. One of the difficulties that I have found is getting people to work together. The human ego is the greatest distraction in the Sasquatch hunt. There are various people in various groups who won't share information because they want to be first across the finishing line. I always remember Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare. The race is not always to the swiftest, but to the smartest, plain and simple as that. I feel that we are on the cutting edge right now in terms of cryptid research anywhere in the world. People have been dropping cameras into Loch Ness, Okanagan Lake, a variety of bodies of water around the world without much success. I'd have to say, physically, the Sasquatch world is eons ahead of anybody else because we have had material. We have hair samples that have been brought in. We've even had follicles, but the DNA has degenerated, things like that, that have made it difficult for us to extract DNA evidence. But I would say, in terms of the technologies that are being used, the people that we are employing in this field today, it's a phenomenal world, and from a law enforcement point of view, this would be a wonderful testing ground for a lot of the things that we do in the field when we're actually conducting investigations and such. And you guys would be the best guinea pigs in the world, to tell you the truth. But try talking to your superior officers about stuff like that. You tend to get, you got a nice hobby there, Kirk, but, keep it out of the office type thing. And that's how it must be with Professor Meldrum and those in the scientific community who face these sort of barriers from what we call the establishment, whether it's scientific or legal. I would exhort anybody who wants to go to the next level here to be aware of the DNA evidence as the only conclusive thing that will generate a reaction in the legal and scientific worlds. I can tell you about a real experience here in that regard. And this is not a policing one, but it's a scientific one. About 2.5 years ago, Dr. Rob McCall, who graduated from Oxford University in the UK, went to the Kingdom of Bhutan, which is in between India and Nepal, in search of their version of the Yeti, which is called the Meager. And he was accompanied by a wildlife conservationist who also happens to be the Prince of Nepal. He's the King of Nepal's brother, an eminent scientist, very well qualified at English University himself. They went on an expedition in the interior of Bhutan in search of evidence of the meager. And they were fortunate to locate an eyewitness who had had a very recent encounter with one of the meagers. And he was able to direct them to a tree where he saw the creature sort of scratching and looking for forage, as it were. When they went to the tree, they had the common sense to look for hair follicles and hair samples, and they were able to locate several of them. They packaged these very carefully. And let me just give you a tip here. Do not put DNA samples in plastic bags because of condensation. It causes deterioration. If you ever found a hair sample with a follicle or any hair sample, put it in a paper bag and keep it in the freezer of your refrigerator. Okay? Common sense stuff. Well, the sample was taken back to the Institute of Molecular Biology at Oxford University and was examined by Dr. Brian Sykes. I know a fair bit about Dr. Brian Sykes because I'm involved in genealogy. I'm one of these nutcase Scotsmen that wants to know who his ancestor was when they came off the boat from Norway, Ireland, or Normandy. And he's written extensively on genetic traits, ancestries, and what have you. In fact, 35 volumes, I believe. And he was able to trace the origins of a certain group of the Celtic people far away from where they thought it was to a place in Austria. Anyway, Dr. Sykes has examined the follicle, has extracted DNA from it, and has announced, quite point blank, without any further fanfare, that it is the DNA of an unknown primate. There is nothing to reference it to. Now, whether it's the meager, the yeti, the Sasquatch, or whatever you want to call it, it is certainly, we don't know whether it is any of those, but it is certainly that of an unknown primate. If we were able to extract that kind of evidence today, I'd have it down at Dr. Fahrenbach's lab, or I'd draw upon the auspices of gentlemen like Dr. Meldrum and others and say, let's have it examined. We also have facilities, very sympathetic facilities up at the University of British Columbia to have that sort of thing examined. But I believe it is critical that we get the DNA evidence. I cannot harp on long enough in this regard because it is the one thing that authentically and solidly documents what many of us have been looking for many years. It vindicates people like John Green and Peter Byrne, Grover, René de Hinden, and the many others who have put in decades in this research. Thank you for your time today. Cheers, man.